Donald Trump sparked uproar yesterday after branding Ukraine's hero wartime leader a dictator without elections. The U.S. president warned modestly successful comedian Volodymyr Zelensky must move fast, or he is not going to have a country left. But Mr. Trump was accused of living in fantasyland over his sympathetic view toward Russian tyrant Vladimir Putin. The war of words erupted after the Ukrainian leader, a stand-up comedian before he was elected, accused Mr. Trump of living in a disinformation space. That followed the U.S. leader's claims that Zelensky, rather than invader Putin, started the conflict 3 years ago. In return, Mr. Trump used his Truth Social platform to accuse Mr. Zelensky of playing his predecessor Joe Biden like a fiddle. The U.S. president said, "He refuses to have elections is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections, Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something all admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do." Mr. Trump also said Europe has failed to bring peace. Last night Sir Keir Starmer hit out after speaking to Mr. Zelensky. His spokesman said, the Prime Minister expressed his support for President Zelensky as Ukraine's democratically elected leader and said it was perfectly reasonable to suspend elections during war as the UK did during World War II. The Prime Minister reiterated his support for the US-led efforts to get a lasting peace in Ukraine. There was widespread dismay at Mr. Trump's claims Ukraine should never have taken up arms against the invading Russians and his comments that the war was entirely avoidable and Mr. Zelensky was not elected and unpopular. Those comments were widely condemned around the globe amid false claims by Mr. Trump that the U.S. had given more support to Ukraine than Europe had. Elections in Ukraine were suspended under martial law following the 2022 invasion. Politicians warned the U.S. attacks would only unite people behind their leader. Despite Mr. Trump's claims, Europe has given more aid to Ukraine than America, both in real cash terms and relative to GDP. Europe handed over PS $109 billion, compared to America's PS $94 billion, according to Berlin's Kiel Institute. The tirade comes after the U.S. leader said he was disappointed Mr. Zelensky had complained about being left out of peace talks with Russia. Vice President J.D. Vance branded the Ukraine response disgraceful, warning Mr. Zelensky not to bait the White House. UK Defense Secretary John Healey said, 3 years ago, one country illegally invaded another, and since then, the Ukrainians have been fighting for their freedom. They've been fighting for their future, and they still are. Insulting. Former UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace accused the White House of pumping out fake news, adding Mr. Trump's words were straight out of the Kremlin talking points. Ex-PM Boris Johnson, who was in office when the war began, said, "Of course Ukraine didn't start the war, you might as well say that America attacked Japan at Pearl Harbor." But he claimed Mr. Trump's statements are meant to shock Europeans into action. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politicians insisted support for Mr. Zelensky is overwhelming, and it is insulting for Mr. Trump to demand elections. MPs in Kyiv warned it would be impossible to hold ballots before a ceasefire, and said their leader has more than 50% support. Speaking on the Sun's Never Mind the Ballots show, a leading Trump ally, Republican Congressman Dan Crenshaw, warned Europe must become uncomfortably aggressive with Russia ahead of any negotiations. He said it was time to out-crazy the Kremlin, with boots on the ground in Ukraine. Western officials have insisted Britain is determined to keep Ukraine in the fight, despite the war of words. A source said former President Biden gave Kyiv enough weapons to survive into the summer before he left office. But they warned Ukraine needed more troops to replace their dead and wounded. They said, "We're fortunate that at the end the Biden administration was able to put a lot of kit into Ukraine, and that sustains Ukraine." Ukraine is under a lot of pressure in the east, but Russia is continuing to take massive casualties for tiny gains of territory. They warned, "We know Ukraine has got to do more with its people." Shortly after this week's peace talks in Saudi Arabia between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian officials, a Russian drone blitz on Odessa injured 4 and left tens of thousands without power. It was just hours after Moscow said it never hit civilian targets. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, speaking after the talks, claimed his country never endangered Ukraine's energy system. The U.S. request for a pause in Russia's power station blitz was the only concession asked for.